What is good, everyone? I'm Forrest Walker, and hello from Yerevan, Armenia. Now, I've been meaning to make this video for a while. Over in my blog Shooter Files, I always make an annual photo recap of the previous year. So now that I'm making videos, I wanted to do that here. I know we're now in March, but I'm ready to do it, so let's get into it. So I'll share a little bit about my year last year in 2020, and then I'll get into sharing some photos from the year, most of which haven't been seen. But starting with last year, it, of course, was unlike any other year before. It was a horrible year. I know it was horrible for a lot of people. Definitely was bad for me. But before it even really started, when it came to the pandemic, it was already a very different year. After 5 years on the road working on my major city work, I finally finished in 2019. So 2020 was the first year post-project, and I had a lot of plans, a lot of things going. For one, I was going to start working on the book, create one book, had a couple zines coming out. I had a lot of different work scheduled too. I was more focused on making money. I had a whole workshop schedule. I had a lot of different things going. And back in February 2020, I was in Sao Paulo, Brazil, photographing the carnival there, had some other work there. And then I had a variety of work scheduled all around South America through summer. And it was around mid-March when everything just shut down. All the borders shut down, flights canceled, work canceled. And I was stuck in Sao Paulo during its whole shutdown, lockdown through June. And at one point it became the epicenter of the pandemic while I was there. And then in June I went up to Portland, where I'm from, was there for a little bit. Basically it was mostly shut down there too. And then I came to Istanbul, Turkey, did some work there. And then they went into lockdown too. Then I was in Belarus for a month. And then I came to where I'm at now in Yerevan, Armenia, but that wasn't until this year in January. And out of those 4 cities, 3 had lockdown, shutdowns. So after the previous 5 years covering over 100 major cities across 75 countries, so averaging over 20 cities, 20 countries a year, it was a much different year in 2020, plus the pandemic, plus the shutdowns, constant lockdowns, and then losing all the work. And I had a lot of plans to really get things going now that I was finally done with all that major city work and really bringing it together. So some of that has been postponed. I'm working on it now, and I'm really trying to get back to a home base so I can really focus in one place. But like I said, I'm stuck in limbo right now. So that's where I was at in 2020, and I'm not going to get into too much detail because it was a really bad year. And I know it's been bad for a lot of people. It was probably especially bad for me, though, to be honest. But trying to keep positive and get things going now. And this is really just about the photos. So even though I had some of the lockdowns and I couldn't really photograph like normal, I did do some things. Like when I first was in Sao Paulo, I photographed the carnival there. And if you're familiar with the carnival at all, especially in Brazil, it's a multi-week event, parties, block parties all over. It's a crazy scene, unlike really anything anywhere else. People everywhere on the streets, very social, people, being as close as possible. And that was at the very end of February. So it was only a couple weeks later, I think 3 weeks to be exact, where it went to complete lockdown, shutdown. Everything was shut down. You had restrictions, people wearing masks, social distancing, all that. And so that was only in a matter of a couple weeks where you went from one extreme to the other. So it was a very, very weird time to be there, especially since Brazil became the epicenter at one point of the pandemic. So since I had already photographed the carnival and I was shut down there and kind of depressed from losing all the work and all my plans, I decided I have to focus on something to keep the creativity going. So I focused on that whole transition. And then from there, even not just the pandemic, there started to be a lot of different conflict, political unrest, things like that. By the time I left, I was getting tear gassed in the streets and the police were everywhere. So it got pretty crazy there. So I don't think there was probably anywhere in the world where you went from such extremes to the next. So I photographed that. It turned out to be very interesting. So that's going to be a zine this year. And then I had some other smaller projects too, but I'm going to have 3 zines I have planned coming out this year. Most of it's from a major city work prior. So now that I've given you a little context of my year in 2020, now we can get into the photos. And before we get into the photos from 2020. I want to share some of the photos that I submitted this year to different festivals. Because a lot of my work was canceled, I had to focus on creating and doing other work. I also decided to submit to more festivals than I usually do, and that turned out to be one of the few highlights of the year, because every photography festival that I submitted to in 2020, I was at least a finalist in, and some of them I won. And I'm going to go through some of the photos that were finalists and exhibited, and also some of the photos in series too that were winners in different festivals. And then we'll get into a few photos from each city I was in this year, and I'll give some details behind that. But for this, we're going to get into my computer to do that so I can really share these photos with you and go over them. So let's get into my 2020 photo recap. Let's go. All right, so I'm going to share this 2020 photo recap that I put together, starting off with some of the award winners and features I had throughout the year, and then finishing with the photos that I actually made throughout 2020. A few selections from each city, not necessarily the best from each city. I try to save the absolute best, but some of the better ones just to give you a look at where I was at. So we're starting off at the Bangkok Street Photography Festival at the start of last year. This photo was made in Jamala, Latvia, just outside of Riga, when I was covering that city on the major city work. This is a photo that I will cover in more detail in a future video. It gets a lot of questions, but this was in Jamala, Latvia. And the other finalist photo at the Bangkok Festival was this photo, which was in Zanzibar City, just at the port there. And that's when I was covering Dar es Salaam, Tanzania on the major city work. I took an overnight trip to Zanzibar. Now, this next photo was taken in Lima, Peru, in the neighborhood of Miraflores, and it's one of two finalists I had at the Italian Street Photography Festival in the single image category. The other finalist in the single images was this one here, taken in Zagreb, Croatia. Both of these last two cities, I was working on the major city work when I made these photos. Most of these photos I actually will go into more detail in future videos because a lot of them have different stories behind them. I was also a first place winner at the Italian Street Photography Festival, so I'll share that right now. And I have this series called Limbo that I created. I actually created it for the Italian Street Photography Festival. It was the first time I submitted it anywhere. And this series was taken from a larger project that will be a zine later this year, and I'll make a video on that too in more detail. But it's kind of a play on limbs. That's where the name comes from, but there's a lot more to that. There's different connections from photo to photo, and it somewhat tells a story in the larger project. But here you can see the actual series that won first place at the Italian Street Photography Festival. This photo is from Mumbai, India. Accra, Ghana. Guangzhou, China. Valparaiso, Chile. Lima, Peru. Havana, Cuba. Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Montevideo, Uruguay. And Mexico City, Mexico. And again, I'll go into this project behind the series in more detail when I release the zine later this year in a future video. Okay, now we'll go back over here. This photo here was a winner at the Urban Photo Awards, and it was taken in Brighton Beach in New York City, Brooklyn. And as always, all these photos are completely unposed. This photo here was the second place winner at All About Photo magazine, and it was also featured in that magazine. This one won a few awards actually last year, but it was taken in Accra, Ghana. This photo, which you've already seen from Zagreb, Croatia, was a finalist at the Miami Street Photography Festival. This photo here was the first place winner at StreetFoto Istanbul in the Istanbul category. This is actually one of the first photos I took during the major city work in city number 1, Istanbul, Turkey. And in that same festival, StreetFoto Istanbul, I also was a finalist in the international category, single image. And this photo is from Nairobi, Kenya, when I was working on the major city work covering it. And this photo again was a finalist at the Istanbul StreetFoto from Lima, Peru. And then I was also a finalist in a series that I submitted there, a different series than this. In Living Color is the title of the series. It might become a zine later too. I'm not sure about that yet, but it is from a larger project too with the same title, In Living Color. So we can go through the series here. And it's obviously has a lot to do with color, but the mixture of color and life. And this photo is from Diradawa, Ethiopia. This photo here is from Los Angeles, California, USA. Havana, Cuba. Barcelona, Spain. Bangkok, Thailand. Harar, Ethiopia. San Juan, Puerto Rico. And Hyderabad, India. And for this, I'll release a video later this year too, going over the larger project. Back to these photos, and this one I took at the start of the major city work in 2016 too, and it's been featured every year somewhere, and this was in a few magazines last year, one of them being All About Photo too. But now we'll get into the photos throughout the year, starting in chronological order of where I was at, and I started off the year in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And while I was in Sao Paulo, Brazil, I photographed the carnival, which goes on for a couple weeks with different outside block parties in different areas on different days. And while I was there, of course, the pandemic started. So I ended up being shut down there from March to June during the whole peak of the pandemic in Sao Paulo, which it did become the epicenter. So I had to find other work and other ways to focus since most of my work was canceled. And I decided while I was there to focus on a larger project because I had already photographed the carnival. And I'm going to go into this in greater detail in a future video. But the future zine is called From Carnival to COVID. And I'll share a few photos from Carnival, then into the pandemic. But in a future video, I'm going to go into greater detail before I release the zine on this. And the zine will be more like a paperback book because there's quite a few photos. But here's a few. This is at one of the block parties, of course. And this is at the very start of the pandemic. This graffiti was only out there for a couple days and it got covered. Just a block from where I was staying. The city drastically changed. As you can see, everything shut down, but people are wearing masks, even the statue. But there was still actually quite a bit of life outside in certain areas. This was a park nearby, and people were exercising. And by the time I left, there was so much political unrest because the president actually was against shutdowns, but Sao Paulo was shut down because of the governor. And so there was people on both sides. So there was protests, and by the time I left, I was getting tear gassed and police were everywhere and things were getting broken. But the full project I'm pretty happy with, and I'm looking forward to releasing that so you all can see. Then when I was able to get out of Sao Paulo, all the borders still were closed everywhere, but I was, of course, able to get back to my home country. And I went back to my home state to see family and where I'm from in Portland, Oregon. So I stopped there for a bit. And when I was there, it was basically shut down, and that was during the peak of all the protesting going on in the States. And Portland was really kind of the epicenter. It was over 100 days of protests, I believe. So there was not a whole lot going on other than protests, and most of those happened at night, too. Everything was boarded up everywhere in the center. And this is actually my brother's dog. We went out camping. And then from there, I took a flight to Istanbul, Turkey, for a bit to do some work there. So this is Istanbul. along the bridge there, Galata Bridge. I actually talked about this photo. I took it on one of my photo walk talks in Manonu. So if you haven't seen that video, I would check it out. Turkey was one of the few places really fully open without restrictions to foreigners, and already being such a hot spot for tourism, it was packed when I got there with tourists. People were going there from all over because it was one of the few spots they could go to. So I actually lived in Istanbul back in 2015 through 2016 when I started the major city work, and it was no different at all when I first got there from when I lived there before, maybe even more chaotic and more people. But then things changed. I'd say after I was there for a month, things started to get a little worse with the numbers. And this was far after they'd been open since June, and I didn't get there until September. So it wasn't until after summer things really started to change. And by the time I left, it was shut down, lockdowns, curfews, and mask ordinances everywhere. They had police everywhere making sure you wore a mask and things like that. So I caught this on the main pedestrian street right there. Here's another photo that was in the Emanonu Photo Walk Talk video that you can check out. But I caught this shot as they pulled down their masks to kiss as I walked by. And here's one more photo from Istanbul. As you can see, the Galata Tower there. It's kind of a play on color, complementary colors there. And from Istanbul, I went to Minsk, Belarus, as I still wasn't able to get home, and I had to leave Istanbul because my visa was ending. So I decided on Minsk for a month. I hadn't been there before. I'd always kind of wanted to visit it and cover it. And they had no restrictions at all. Really the only place in Europe that didn't. There was no place in Asia. So it was one of the few options, and it actually wasn't a bad option. Gave me a different type of scene. And since it was Christmas time and winter, it was one of the few places where I got that real Christmas and winter atmosphere. So it was a good experience. This photo here is at October Square in Minsk when they were setting up the Christmas decorations. And I kind of like the connection between the metallic horse and her metallic jacket. This here. Now it was below freezing pretty much the whole time I was there. It snowed a couple times, but I really only had 2 days of sun the whole month I was there. The rest were cloudy and overcast or snowing. And this was the second of those 2 days. And I wish I had more sunny days because when the light was out, you had that beautiful winter light. This amusement park was set up where they also had a major Christmas market, which I covered in another photo walk talk on Christmas markets in Minsk, so check that out. It's exclusive to Patreon. And this was the operator. I just liked him as he was standing up there going. This is in that same area inside the skating rink. So you have the Christmas decorations. It's very Christmassy. This is on one of the days it snowed. I like the white of snow and how it looks when it lands on trees, and so I just waited for a little bit of life to go in the middle, and I liked her because she was in all black. She stands out more. And we'll finish off with this more picturesque photo. This was on the same day with some sun. You have some swans and the ducks and the nice light. In the future, I'll share more photos from 2020, including some of my favorites or some of the ones that maybe are going to be published in different zines or even a book. But for now, we'll get out of the slideshow and we'll finish off this 2020 recap. All right, so I hope you enjoyed going through those photos and that 2020 recap. I didn't get to photograph nearly as much as I would have liked to, but I still was lucky to photograph as much as I did. And I did save some of the best ones from 2020. I look forward to releasing those in the future, and a few of them will probably be published in a zine or maybe even a future book. So I wish everyone the best out there in 2021. Hope you get to photograph a lot more and get to do a lot of things you've been wanting to do that you haven't been able to do for a while. So again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video. Cheers.